Okay, so the last question I have for today says, how is religion woven into the routine and culture of Israeli life?
So it's such a fascinating question, and it's such a different question from the rest of them. Jewish culture, much of it is religious culture, and some of it's not religious culture at all, right? Like the food that we eat, some of it is religious, like matzah on Passover, which is religious in a sense. And then you have different, Jewish foods that have come from different places that Jews ended up in the world, like gefilte fish, which is, I wouldn't say it's religious in any way. It's just happens to be a Jewish food, right? So, but in the sense that like Jewish culture has much of it has been religious culture. You see that a lot in Israel. Like you walk into a store in Israel and they're going to have a mezuzah hanging on the wall, right? This roll of parchment that Jews put on their homes and in places of business or places where people basically eat, sleep, or pray. And that's going to be there. And when you go to school in Israel, you're going to learn Jewish culture and Jewish traditions, which many of them are religious. So in the day to day, I think there's ways that, you could fully avoid it. If you're an Arab Israeli who lives in an Arab Israeli town like Nazareth, you're not going to see any Jewish religion day to day on your streets. You just won't. If you're in Jerusalem, you will. You might, be walking down the street and you might pass by a synagogue and people will be in there praying because we pray 3 times a day. If you go into a regular restaurant, they might have, alongside menus, they might have, benchers, which are, the prayer after meal for you to read, but you don't have to read them. They're there if you want them. So again, I think there's ways, if you live in Tel Aviv, you're in like such a secular environment of people who I would say many of them hate religion and shun religion. So I think it really depends where you are in Israel. But I think it is important to note, like much of Jewish culture, because we were in exile for so long, so much of Jewish culture, I should stress we were in exile, but for 3,000 years, Jews have always lived continuously in Israel. It's just most of us were in exile. Much of our tradition became religious tradition, which became naturally part of Jewish culture. So we talk about Jewish culture, religious culture, and sometimes they're one and the same, and sometimes they're not at all. So is it interwoven? No. There are ways that you can completely avoid it. Yes. And then there's other times where you can't avoid it at all. It just depends on the context, what city you're in, what time of the year is it, where are you? Like all of those things will matter. But the concept of like religion is heavy in Israel, yeah, in certain areas, not everywhere, not for everybody. And no, we don't have a full separation of church and state in Israel, of religion and state in Israel. And so it's definitely part of the politics in Israel as well, which absolutely plays a role. And I would say, again, since I've said this a lot today, is, I don't understand like domestic Swedish issues because I'm not a Swede and I don't live in Sweden. I think it's really hard for people who don't live in Israel, who are not like really intertwined in Israeli domestic issues, to fully understand this. I think Jews who live abroad, who don't live in Israel, might have a much better understanding because they might be in tune with it, but I also think some are not at all. So just like, I think I want to just a word of caution, like be careful judging other people's domestic issues. Like the same way that we don't like when Americans kind of look at America and are like the racism, this, that. And it's kind of like, maybe you don't know, maybe you don't understand the full story. I would say the same about Israel. Like it's complicated. There are a lot of layers to it. But it is ultimately, Jews are a people. They have a religion. It's called Judaism, but we're in one of the holiest places in the world, right? I live in Jerusalem, in the center, the heart and soul of not just Judaism, but also Christianity and Islam's third holiest site. And so I'm surrounded by religion in my city simply because of the nature of the city that I live in. But drive 45 minutes to Tel Aviv, not a religious city, founded 100 years ago, 1909. Very different approach. So it's just it's complicated, and it's worth coming to see for yourself if you haven't already. And you'll kind of get what I'm talking about as soon as you land in Israel, because there's incredible amounts of diversity, both from the religious standpoint and not just different religions, but within the Jewish people. There are so many different ways to be a Jew religiously or not religiously. So there's a lot to this question, but again, like I've said with all of the rest of them, I will leave it there.
Well, Charlotte, thank you so much for joining me on JTV. I'm really honoured to have had you on. And I can't wait to send this back to all the people that the questions came from. And this is JTV. I'm Annabelle. See you soon.